From this cop who committed 13 gruesome murders to this cop who planned a fellow sheriff's murder, and then this cop who killed her ex's wife, we have chilling proof that some cops have turned into dangerous murderers. Cops are meant to protect the public and enforce the law, but some of them commit treacherous crimes that are so inhumane they are given chilling convictions and end up in the worst prisons. Joseph DAngelo. When we talk of dangerous cops who have committed murders that send chills down one's spine, serial killer and rapist Joseph DAngelo cannot be ignored. The now 78-year-old was nicknamed the Golden State Killer as a result of the outrageous, psychotic, and utterly disgusting crimes he had committed. This former officer had committed over 13 murders, 151 rapes, and 120 burglaries across California between 1974 and 1986. He was so obsessed with his victims that he would break into their homes by prying open their windows or doors while they slept. He would also attack couples, tie up both of them, rape the female, then kill them ruthlessly. In April 2018, authorities were able to use new DNA technology to link the 1978 murders of the Rancho Cordova couple to Joseph DAngelo. There was no doubt that the lights had dimmed and it was finally over for the former police officer as he was arrested on April 24th at his home in Citrus Heights. On June 29, 2020, he pleaded guilty to 13 counts of first-degree murder and was sentenced 13 consecutive life sentences without parole. For such disgusting crimes, it is almost pleasing to know he currently serves his sentence in the notorious California State Prison Corcoran. The Golden State Killer might have committed disgusting crimes, but the next notorious cop will send chills down your spine. Derek Michael Chauvin. If his name doesn't ring a bell, I'm sure his actions will. The infamous George Floyd case that took the internet by storm is still fresh in our minds. The now 48-year-old former Minneapolis police officer murdered George Floyd, a 46-year-old African-American, in the most mentally disturbing way. Derek handcuffed Floyd, then pressed a knee on his neck for about 9.5 minutes on the street outside a convenience store. The viral video was the beginning of Derek's doom, and possibly his worst nightmare. With each passing day, people stormed the streets and asked for justice. The tension had risen to the highest level, and even Derek's title as a police officer couldn't save him. His actions were found disgusting, and after a tiresome trial, Mr. Chauvin was found guilty on April 20th, 2021 of second-degree murder, third-degree murder, and second-degree manslaughter. He was sentenced to 22.5 years in prison and is currently held at a federal penitentiary. Most murderers keep the crime away from their family, but our next cop didn't spare his own family, and his crimes didn't just give him a scary sentence, but it also sent him to a notorious prison. Bobby Lee Cutts Jr. This former police officer in the Canton, Ohio department did something that left thousands of people around the world shocked by his disgusting actions. On June 15, 2007, a 26-year-old American woman named Jessie Davis was reported missing from her home in Lake Township, Stark County, Ohio. Her mother was the one who reported her missing after finding her 2-year-old son home alone with bleach spilled on the floor and the furniture broken and overturned. This case drew the attention of a lot of people because of the mysteries surrounding it. On June 23, 2007, Bobby Cutts Jr. was arrested and charged with 2 counts of murder. The Canton Police Department, where Bobby Cutts Jr. worked, did not consider him a suspect and did not participate in the arrest. The arrest was executed by the FBI and the local sheriff's department. It was also reported that other allegations of abuse had previously been leveled against Bobby Cutts Jr. in Stark County. It was absolutely shocking for everyone to discover that Jessie's own boyfriend and father of her son and unborn daughter was the one who brutally murdered her. After investigation, Bobby Cutts Jr. was sentenced on February 27, 2008 to life imprisonment without the eligibility of parole for 57 years, and he must serve each of his murder convictions consecutively. The next officer on our list was sent to a prison which houses over 645 inmates on death row because of her despicable actions. Amber Geiger. The former off-duty patrol officer and the first female on our list undoubtedly leaves one gagging at her actions. It all started on the night of September 6, 2018, when 26-year-old accountant Botham Jean was murdered in Dallas, Texas by off-duty police department officer Amber Geiger. Amber meticulously entered Jean's apartment and shot him without a second thought. She claimed to have entered Jean's apartment believing it was her own and thought Jean was a burglar, so she shot him. This explanation seems suspicious and made up, and for many people it was absolutely completely unacceptable. She was initially charged with manslaughter, but the absence of murder charges led to protests about race and equality. At that point, the walls had closed in for Geiger, and she was indicted on a charge of murder on November 30th, 2018. It was clear that there was no escape anymore because on October 1st, 2019, she was found guilty of murder and was sentenced to 10 years imprisonment the following day. The ruling was eventually upheld on appeal in 2021, but it was denied by a Texas court. Amber Geiger is currently held at the Mountain View unit in Coryell County, which houses over 645 inmates on death row. Next up, we have a serial killer and former officer who took gruesome murders to the next level and committed gag-worthy crimes. Marvin Lee Irvin. The American serial killer and former police officer has been imprisoned for his gruesome crimes and the atrocities he has committed. He had committed a total of 3 murders before he was finally caught and charged for the murders. He murdered 2 women in Missouri, St. Joseph, Missouri in September and October 1990. Just like all criminals, his consistent criminal track had to come to an end eventually. After his arrest, he confessed to an additional 1979 murder, which up to that point, he had been the prime suspect in the murder case. Marvin Lee had been the prime suspect in the case, but it was only after his arrest in 1999 that he confessed to her homicide. Shockingly, it was discovered that Mickey was also a friend to Lee's wife. He eventually pleaded guilty and was sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. He currently serves his sentence at the Jefferson City Correctional Center. Next on the list, we have a former LAPD detective whose crime was not just committed out of jealousy, but out of evil, psychotic intentions. Stephane Eileen Lazarus. This time, the second woman on the list is a former LAPD detective. Yes, a detective was found to be a murderer, and this case only gets more baffling with each discovery. On February 24, 1986, Stephanie Lazarus entered her ex's Van Nuys condo and struck Rasmussen in the head with a vase. Rasmussen was a nurse who married her ex-boyfriend. Lazarus shot Rasmussen 3 times in the chest with a .38 caliber pistol while she used a pillow as an improvised silencer. After killing her, Lazarus then staged the murder to look like a robbery. Of course, a detective would be able to pull that off effortlessly, though at the time of the killing, Lazarus had only been a police officer for 2 years. She went on to have a family and work as an art theft detective for the Los Angeles Police Department. She was found guilty of first-degree murder and was sentenced to 27 years to life in prison at the Carolina Institution for Women in Chino. Next up is not just a suspected serial killer, but also a kidnapper and former cop whose crimes are absolutely despicable. David Stephen Middleton. Middleton, who is nicknamed the Cable Guy, is an American former police officer, kidnapper, murderer, and suspected serial killer. This former cop's crimes had him sentenced to death each time, but fortunately or unfortunately for him, he is still alive. He was convicted and sentenced to death for the murder of 2 women in Nevada, committed in 1994 and 1995. He is also said the prime suspect in at least 1 additional murder in Colorado, and also committed while he served in the Miami-Dade Police Department. The jury then found Middleton guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder, 2 counts of first-degree kidnapping, 1 count of grand larceny, 1 count of fraudulent use of a credit card, and 2 counts of felon in possession of a firearm. The jury sentenced Middleton to death for each murder. He is currently held at the Ely State Prison, Nevada, and is currently on death row. Police officers might have dominated this list so far, but next up is a former Georgia correctional officer who murdered a prison inmate. Lloyd Hopkins. Violence in prison is not unusual, but violence between an inmate and a correctional officer, which eventually led to a murder, is definitely unusual. Hopkins, the former Georgia Department of Corrections officer, was arrested after the death of an Augusta prison inmate. The Georgia Department of Corrections reported that Roderick Hayes, who was 39 years old, died as a result of an altercation with Hopkins. The victim had been sentenced to 25 years in state custody for trafficking of person, for labor or sexual servitude, and was serving 10 years for another charge. The Georgia Department of Corrections also stated that 2 had been charged with felony murder and aggravated assault in the investigation. Not much about the case has been revealed, but Hayes definitely didn't go scot-free. According to authorities, Hopkins was charged with party to crime of murder, party to crime of aggravated assault, and violation of oath of office, and he is currently being held at the Columbia County Center without bond. From adult murders, we now have a juvenile murder on the list. Next up is an officer who horrifyingly murdered a 15-year-old boy. Roy Oliver. He's a former Balch Springs police officer and convicted murderer. Roy was convicted for killing an unarmed 15-year-old. Yes, it wasn't a robbery situation where the boy was armed. It was an unprovoked interaction that led to murder. On April 29, 2017, Jordan Edwards, an American boy, was murdered by Roy Oliver in Balch Springs, Texas, within the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex. How Edward was shot is still something that is talked about till this day. He was shot in the back of the head while riding in the front passenger seat of a vehicle driving away from officers that attempted to stop it. On May 5, 2017, Oliver was fired from the department and arrested. Then on August 28, 2018, he was found guilty of murder and sentenced to 15 years in prison. He is currently serving his sentence at the Huntsville, Texas prison. Next up on the list is a supervisory border agent who was given a staggering sentence after murdering 4 sex workers in horrifying ways. Juan David Ortiz. Ortiz is an American serial killer and former Border Patrol agent who murdered 4 sex workers in Texas in September 2018. Unfortunately for him, he was caught and arrested after a potential victim escaped and alerted the police. Now, it is important to note that Ortiz committed all 4 murders in the same manner. Yes, he brutally killed the women all in the same manner, though they were killed on different days. The 5 victims, including the one who escaped, were sex workers. 3 out of the 4 murder victims were women, and 1 was transgender. He confessed after his arrest that he had started his ruthless killing on September 3rd and that he personally knew the first 2 victims. His trial began on November 28, 2022, and on December 7, 2022, he was convicted of all 4 murders and was sentenced to life in prison without parole. He currently serves his time at an unknown penitentiary. We have had officers who murdered strangers, inmates, romantic rivals, and girlfriends on the list, but now we have an officer that murdered his own wife and someone unexpected next on the list. Drew Walter Peterson. This 70-year-old former officer is an American convicted murderer and former Bolingbrook, Illinois police sergeant who was found guilty of murdering his 3rd wife, Kathleen Savio, in 2012. He was reported to have murdered her a few months after they got divorced in 2003. Mysteriously, it was noted that the 2012 murder of his 3rd wife wasn't the first time the police officer received publicity for the wrong reasons. Back in 2007, Peterson received national publicity after his 4th wife, Stacey Ann Cales Peterson, disappeared. Kathleen Savio's bruised body was found in a dry bathtub in her house in 2004 with a large gash on her scalp. At first, Savio's cause of death was said to be accidental drowning, and the case seemed to have been closed until Peterson's luck vanished and he was indicted for her murder in 2009 after a second autopsy showed evidence of a struggle. He was sentenced to 38 years in prison on February 21, 2013. That could have been all for Peterson, but he did something completely evil and unexpected. Peterson was convicted on May 31, 2016 and sentenced to an additional 40 years on July 29, 2016, and then on February 21, 2017, he was transferred from Illinois Department of Corrections custody to the United States Penitentiary in Terre Haute, Indiana. He was supposed to serve his sentence there, but in December 2019, he was transferred to an undisclosed out-of-state facility. Next up on the dangerous officers list is an officer that was found guilty of homicide and raised race discussions on the internet. Michael Slager. This former local police officer in North Charleston, South Carolina, United States, has been convicted for a very controversial shooting. Slager fatally shot 50-year-old Walter Scott, and the devastating incident also had video evidence. In the video, Slager could be seen shooting Scott from behind while he was fleeing after he had stopped Scott for a non-functioning brake light. There were several sides to the story which grasped the attention of several people around the world. After a proper independent investigation by the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division, the FBI, the Office of the U.S. Attorney for the District of South Carolina, and the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division also conducted their own investigations. It was finally visible that the end was near for Slager, because in June 2015, a South Carolina grand jury indicted Slager on a charge of murder. After a tiresome trial and mistrial, Slager was sentenced to 20 years in prison in December 2017, with the judge determining that the underlying offense was a second-degree murder. He currently serves his time at the FCI Englewood Prison in Colorado. This next cop's offense landed him a double life sentence without parole because of how atrocious his act was. Stephen Arthur Rios. The murder of Jesse Valencia, a 23-year-old college student, caused a lot of confusion and conversation because of the questionable events that led to his death. Stephen Rios, who was a well-recognized police officer at the time with a family of his own, was convicted of Valencia's murder. Valencia was found dead after he left a campus party. He had no defensive wounds on his body, but the strangulation marks on his throat revealed that he was choked before he was slashed. Unexpectedly, Rios was one of the first officers to identify Valencia after he was killed. It was a mysterious occurrence occurrence that was no doubt unfortunate and absolutely unacceptable. Eventually, it was discovered that Rios and Valencia had sexual relations, and Rios killed Valencia only because he wanted their affair to end after he discovered Rios had a family of his own. Rios was sentenced to life imprisonment without parole for murder and a consecutive 10-year charge for the use of a weapon during the crime. A retrial led to Rios's conviction of second-degree murder and armed criminal action, resulting in another life imprisonment and an additional 23-year sentence. He is currently at the South Dakota State Penitentiary. This next cop had an accomplice, and how they murdered their victim is not just evil, but completely horrific. But what they did landed them shocking sentences. Joshua L. Taylor. On July 4, 2019, police officers Joshua L. Taylor and Brandon C. Dingman of the Wilson Police Department in Carter County, Oklahoma, murdered a 28-year-old man named Jared Lakey. They brutally applied taser shocks to him 53 times, causing him to die of cardiac arrest. Taylor and Brandon had been responding to an incident of disorderly conduct when they found Lakey acting confused and disoriented. Rather than being cautious by restraining him, they continuously applied taser shocks to Lakey while he was laying on the ground and made no attempt to provide any life-saving treatment to him. They claimed that the victim had been using illicit drugs, but their lies were revealed by the toxicology results that proved there were no illicit drugs in his system. Both Taylor and Dingman were prosecuted for second-degree murder and were found guilty. They were sentenced to 10 years in prison and are only allowed to go on parole after serving 8.5 years. The next dangerous officer on the list shot his victim ruthlessly for 16 consecutive times, but his court sentence hit him hard. Jason Van Dyke. A 17-year-old named Laquan McDonald was fatally murdered by a Chicago police officer, Jason Van Dyke, on October 20, 2014 in Chicago, Illinois. Initially, police had reported that McDonald was behaving erratically while walking down the street, and he refused to put down a knife that he had lunged at officers. The video of the shooting has been withheld from the public for more than a year. The video immediately ended Van Dyke's possibility of walking away a free man after it was released, because it showed that McDonald was walking away from the police when he was shot 16 times by him. No time was wasted anymore, and that same day Van Dyke was charged with first-degree murder, and then on October 5, 2018, Van Dyke was found guilty of second-degree murder, as well as 16 counts of aggravated battery with a firearm. He was sentenced to prison in January 2019 and was surprisingly released early for good behavior in February 2022. Next on the list is a deadly criminal and former officer whose crimes earned him the name the Wisconsin Suitcase Murderer. Stephen Zelich. The American convicted murderer and former police officer for West Allis, Wisconsin, who was dubbed the Wisconsin Suitcase Murderer by the press as a result of his atrocious acts. Zelich was brutal, and he committed his crimes in the most suffocating ways. He is known for the dumping of the victims' bodies in suitcases on a roadway in Wisconsin. Yes, he actually dumped the victims' bodies in suitcases. It was a completely animalistic and brutal thing to do, but Zelich was not hesitant to commit his crimes. Then in February 2017, he was sentenced to 25 years for second-degree murder for the murder of Laura Simonson. He received another 10 years for the charges of hiding corpses in October 2017. Altogether, Zelich was sentenced to 70 years in prison with a minimum non-parole period of 58 1/3 years, which is a de facto life sentence. That is because his earliest release date, given his multiple sentences, is at a date when it is completely guaranteed he will be dead. Next up is a female security officer in murder who even went as far as escaping from prison after conviction. Lori Bembenek. Bembenek was an American security officer before she was arrested on charges of first-degree murder of Christine Schultz in Milwaukee, Wisconsin on May 28, 1981. The victim, Schultz, was the ex-wife of Alfred O. Fred Schultz. He was a veteran officer with the Milwaukee Police Department. They had been married for several years and had 2 sons together when they divorced in November 1980. He then married Bembenek in January 1981 in Illinois, but the marriage was ruled invalid because Wisconsin does not allow remarriage less than 6 months after divorce. That led the couple to marry again in November 1981 after Christine Schultz had been murdered. In December 1992, Bembenek was sentenced to time and served 10 years probation. For years, she sought to have her sentence overturned, but it didn't happen. Finally, after gaining freedom, Bembenek moved to Vancouver, Washington, where her parents lived. She married again, but died at a hospice facility in Portland, Oregon, at age 52. That was the end of Lori Bembenek. Next up is a Gwinnett County police officer who was convicted in a shocking 1993 murder. Michael Herold Chappell. The former Gwinnett County police officer was convicted in the 1993 murder of a 53-year-old Emma Jean Thompson outside a muffler shop on Peachtree Industrial Boulevard in Sugar Hill, Georgia. It was a shocking case that kept on taking surprising turns. On the evening of April 15, 1993, something absolutely shocking happened. Thompson was shot in the head while she was seated in her parked car. Her body was then discovered inside her car, which was still running. It was found the following morning at Gwynco Muffler Shop on Peachtree Industrial Boulevard in Beaufort. The case was first presided over by a Judge Bishop. Then the verdicts in the case were returned from a jury on September 8, 1995 and September 9, 1995 on life imprisonment instead of the death penalty. He is currently held in the Long State Prison. Next up is a former FBI agent who was involved in a murder conspiracy with some dangerous gang members. John Connelly. In 2005, former FBI agent Connelly's life took a drastic turn after he was indicted on murder and conspiracy to commit murder charges in the 1982 slaying of John B. Callahan and the 1981 murder of Roger Wheeler. Ruger Wheeler was the owner of the World Jai Ali Sporting Cooperation. He stood trial in 2008 in Miami, Florida. Callahan was brutally murdered by John Martirano, who left the corpse in the trunk of a Cadillac in a Miami International Airport parking lot. After several trails that went on and on for several months, Connelly was charged with racketeering and second-degree murder. He was paroled from prison in 2021 without objection from Callahan's widow, but will remain under supervision in Massachusetts until 2047. The next dangerous cop is a former law enforcement officer who conspired to murder a sheriff in the most gruesome way. Sidney Dorsey. The former American law enforcement officer has to be the first on our list so far that tried to murder a fellow officer. Not just an officer, but a sheriff also. He was the first African American to serve as a sheriff of DeKalb County. But Dorsey let his demons out when he lost a 2000 runoff election by challenger Derwin Brown. After losing to Brown, Dorsey arranged to have Brown murdered. On December 25, 2000, was murdered at his home in Decatur, Georgia. On July 20, 2002, Dorsey was convicted of ordering Brown's assassination, and he was sentenced to life in prison on the murder conviction and an additional 23 years on racketeering and violation of oath of office, which also ranges to 10 to 15 years on his several convictions of theft by taking of the path of office of an elected official. He is currently being held at the Georgia Diagnostic and Classification State Prison. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, click on the videos on your screen link to enjoy similar content.